The question tonight is, can we assess art objectively? Now, there might be some common elements across cultures and times that appeal to human sensibilities. For example, most humans tend to appreciate the human form, certain landscapes, patterns such as the golden ratio, and particular intervals of music. I will argue this evening, though, that these are not enough to build a universal or objective aesthetic sensibility. As I had this word taste in the topic, in the title of the topic, I'm going to get rid of this word taste pretty quickly. To me, what taste is that it serves as a social signifier, a way to subtly indicate membership or exclusion from certain social groups. You might have heard of the idea of cultural capital, for example. Cultural capital is a set of practices which may identify you as being educated and so on. However, I think it's better to speak about developing a sensibility than taste. As with language, our aesthetic sensibilities must be nurtured through socialisation and education. Just as we might not intuitively understand jazz or prog rock, understanding great art often requires exposure, explanation and training. This need for guidance implies, while some art appeals broadly, developing an appreciation for specific genres or styles often depends on a learned sensibility rather than an innate taste. When we discuss objectivity in philosophy groups, we've actually come up as quite a handy way of thinking what this term objective means. When we use the term objective, we mean something that exists regardless of human thought. So trees and things might exist if we don't think of them. So the first kind of question I'm going to throw at you in this question of objectively assessing art is the difference between a creator of art and a consumer of art. So I think the meaning of art for the creator is a very, very different thing for us as consumers. For the creator, art could be deeply personal, a means of expressing ideas, emotions or observations. For the audience, however, art is open to interpretation, filtered through individual experiences and biases. This leads us to a phenomenon known as the surplus of text over meaning. In other words, any artwork, and by artwork I'm including the visual arts, theatre, film, music and so on, there is no end to interpretation. Just a little example, you might have heard of a bloke called Shakespeare, there's a few pubs named after him. The way that Shakespeare plays are interpreted is almost endless. So the idea of there being an authoritative or true way of staging a Shakespeare, that there is no final or ultimate interpretation. We also have to talk about the way that meaning changes through history. For example, if we look at medieval artworks, these often contain allegories, which unless you're an expert historian, most of us would have no way of understanding. We could look at some beautiful medieval artwork, find it very beautiful, and yet the significance of a lot of the symbolism in it would be lost to us unless we had trained in medieval art. Going through history closer to the current time, in the 20th century, a German thinker called Walter Benjamin talks about the way that techniques of reproduction have affected art. At one time, someone would have owned one of these artworks. Typically, we're talking here about paintings and so on. Whereas in the 19th and 20th and 21st centuries, we have more and more techniques of reproducing art. So art is now experienced in a number of different contexts, and therefore wouldn't have the same meaning it would have had when it was, say, something painted 400 or 500 years ago. There's a chap called John Burge who wrote an interesting book called Ways of Seeing. And he adds that this shift has made art more accessible, but also more malleable. The reproduction of art in books, ads, various screens let viewers interpret these works differently and puts them into different contexts of meaning. Another concept I'm going to introduce to you is the death of the author. Roland Barthes wrote about this. And the idea here is that the author's intentions may not be important. So what I was saying about us perhaps finding beauty in a medieval artwork, yet the chances are we don't really understand what the author's intentions are. So from this perspective, art is entirely interpretation of the consumer of art and has very little to do with the creator of art. And that might be something worth thinking about for anybody who wants to discuss, could we have art without an author, for example, AI? Something along the lines of, could art be created almost randomly if it's our interpretation of art that's important rather than the creation? It's rather like, you could always think of the AI rather like the old saying about an infinite number of monkeys would eventually type out Shakespeare. So the LLMs are really the same. The modern LLMs are the modern version of your infinite monkeys, one could say. So from what I've said, you might think I'm an entire relative and there'd be no way to rank artworks. Yet I think there are differences of quality within specific genres. So although I don't think it's possible to have a universal standard of appreciation of art, I think we all know, say if you're into certain kinds of music, or if any of you even play music, you have people who are good musicians, people who are bad musicians. It doesn't mean that anything goes. So I think it's possible to have qualities within all of the types of art I've talked about within specific genres. So if you're into jazz, for example, perhaps you're into John Coltrane or something like that. As you develop your understanding of the genre, you will notice things that you wouldn't have noticed when you started. What is more complex is how you would compare things between genres. Could you compare John Coltrane to Bach? I don't know. But it raises another question: are all artworks genres? Because when I was a little boy in the previous millennium, when I went to school, there was the canon of art. There was great literature and there was great art. And yet, I wonder now, are these not just simply different genres? I'd be quite interested if someone was to discuss, for example, is there such a thing called literature which is different from genre works? Or is literature just another genre? So in conclusion, I find the idea of objective art almost incomprehensible, as our aesthetic experience is that of a subject who brings their sensibilities to the artwork in order to create meaning. In a way, art is like language. We're all capable of understanding and creating it, but the specifics depend on our socialization. Just as we speak different languages based on our environment, our artistic tastes and values are culturally shaped. This means that our reading or understanding of art is highly contextual, shaped by our society, our culture, and our point in history. With such variables, how could we hope to establish a universal standard for evaluating art? I suggest the best that we can manage is to have an intersubjective agreement in a particular community in a particular time of history as to what we judge to have artistic merit. Thank you.